Considering time and some questions already raised by two discussants, but I think the two presenters gave us very rich information. I'd like to invite two questions from the audience. Then we ask the two present to answer. Please.
Thank you very much. Very good presentations. Fiscal council is a very good idea. However, monetary policy and fiscal policy are very different. Monetary policy, printing money, nobody will hurt. But fiscal policy, government spending has to be cut. Then someone will be affected. So that is not so much symmetry between the two. Then if fiscal council's proposals were not accepted, what is the punishment? Who will bear the cost? Politicians or government officials? Thank you.
Please.
Okay, thank you. Quick question. Both presenters say that local borrowing is necessary, but then there is a danger in it. And then there is always dilemma, and subnational government borrow should be allowed, but also regulate, monitor, and enforce compliance with rules. And for example, from John also said that fiscal rules should ensure should be implemented well, but leave enough flexibility. So there is always, however, there are a lot of room for gray area. So what is actually we should consider within this gray area? Is that political consideration or technical consideration or what else? Thank you.
Yeah, one more, last one, please.
On the fiscal rules, unfortunately, the experience with enforcing fiscal rules has been pretty dismal. There's a lot of violation of rules, and it's very difficult to impose discipline at both sovereign and sub-sovereign level. So just pose a kind of a challenge for going ahead, a major challenge.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions. John, will you please start from you?
All right, I can start. Yeah, sure. Okay. So I'm going to briefly answer the questions that they were asked. I think the Latin American crisis, the root of the problem back in the 80s, 90s in Brazil, in Argentina, was that basically provincial and state governments, subnational governments, had their own banks. So they had some state banks, some provincial banks, from which they borrowed. And they borrowed without limit. And so these banks went bankrupt. And being bankrupt, they were rescued by the central banks of the countries. But they were rescued by not monetizing the debt. And so that led to hyperinflation. That is sort of the horror story that Peru and other countries tried to avoid, and that Argentina and Brazil, with the fiscal responsibility laws, are trying to have and avoid. Is fiscal decentralization good? How long do we have? Do we have 2 weeks, 3 weeks to talk about that? I will recommend that you read a paper that I just recently published, and I'll share with you, which is in the Journal of Economic Surveys, that looks at, so the title of the paper is The Impact of Fiscal Decentralization. And so it looks at the impact of fiscal decentralization for the last 3 or 4 decades, empirical studies on economic growth, macroeconomic stability, governance issues, including corruption, et cetera, et cetera. Not every impact is positive, but most of the impacts are substantially positive and robust. Okay, so fiscal decentralization is not a monster; it's a good thing that has happened to many countries. But of course, there are many ifs and considerations. And so then, it's true that I think John and I and other speakers have said this, that one size doesn't fit all, that rules, depending, again, borrowing is one of the pillars of fiscal decentralization. So it's complementary to the other pillars. So what you have is expenditure assignments with expenditure needs that need to be financed, and they are financed with own revenues, with transfers, and with borrowing. And so how much borrowing and what rules and so on, it depends on how you design that system. And so on China, so there's a lot that has been done in 2014, but obviously China fiscal decentralization system, in terms of the pillars, has still tremendously difficult issues to deal with. And they have to do with the assignment of expenditure responsibilities. China is the only country where unemployment insurance is a local responsibility. There's a misassignment there, and there is not true revenue autonomy in China. So the solutions are not going to come just because of the rules. A fiscal council for Indonesia, I quite didn't understand that, but and that's with Dean Yoshino. So question 2, the role of fiscal councils is again, this is not panacea, but there are countries where they work really well. They work as watchdogs. They don't make decisions. So you're not transferring fiscal policy power from the Ministry of Finance or the government, the executive, to this independent council. You do that with monetary policy. You have done that, right? Because you transfer that from the Ministry of Economy to the central bank, and the central bank is an independent, supposedly independent authority in most cases. It is. No, the role of the fiscal council is not to make decisions. It is a watchdog that is going to be, if it is independent, it's going to be tremendously honest and forward-coming with fiscal policy. And so the importance here is that those things get published and they go to the press, that the government is not complying with the rules, is breaking the rule, whatever rules that country has. And so that's the role of it. So the same thing will apply for Indonesia. So if Indonesia were to think of a fiscal council, it will not take over your job. Your job is still will be there. Okay, I think that's all I want to cover.
Okay, to answer your question, the first one on decentralization. I think it is very much a political decision. It's in most OECD countries, globalization is considered bad. The answer to that is decentralization, bringing things closer. There is no sort of formal rationale behind it. It's a political reaction. Your question of why do we measure level of debt to income? It is a very crude measure, but it is a measure on that goes to serve the ability of that entity to service its debt over term. I mean, it's the same time, we measure for national governments, we measure gross debt, not net debt, because we assume that most net debt is bad, that governments have. So a more nuanced thing would be to measure it differently. So all these measures are quite crude. If I could just sort of finish, I realize we're way ahead of schedule on fiscal councils. Just to echo what he says, it's a fiscal council is not a monetary policy committee, and at least in OECD countries, this is one of the greatest innovations institutionally in budgeting in recent years, and it has come about very quickly. If we would go back 10 years, there would be 3 or 4 of these. Now virtually every country has them. Their mandates vary greatly in what they do, but the number one function is economic assumptions of the government, that they're not optimistic. For example, in the case of the United Kingdom, the role of the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is their fiscal council, it is not just to check the economic assumptions of the Treasury. The Treasury had zero credibility in economic assumptions. So it was the Office of Budget Responsibility that was given the responsibility for making the economic assumptions. So I think that's the most critical role of fiscal councils, is that the economic assumptions underlying the budget are realistic, and then we can think about a lot of other things. And it's we talked a little bit, or you did, about rainy day funds, and I think they work very well in resource-rich countries. For example, among OECD countries, they work very well in Chile because of copper. They built up the fund during the good years, and they were able to draw down on that during the bad years. Norway has their oil fund, but in countries without resources, sort of having rainy day funds, there are very few examples of OECD countries of them being successful. Thank you.
Can I just add something that Lily said that I think is very important in the context of an epitaph to this conference, right? So we have been talking about borrowing rules, and you said rules are broken, and they're broken most of the time. And I will agree with that. And so let's look at the Maastricht Treaty, 60%. What European country has a 60% debt level to GDP, right? Right, or the maximum deficit allowed, the 3%, and so on. It's broken, and depending on the country that breaks it. The question I have for you is: are we going to be better off if we just do away with rules, or what we see? I think what we talk about today is that this has evolved, right? So that we are going beyond. We're going beyond borrowing rules, debt limit, or whatever. We're going to fiscal responsibility laws, and we're going to fiscal councils, and so other enforcement mechanisms that might do the job. I'm not sure, but I don't want to. I wouldn't end this discussion on public debt and on borrowing with that sad note. I think I will be more optimistic.
I think it's absolutely important to keep the rules, because even the rules are violated, it's good to know that people are violating the rule. Then that's the way you find alternative solutions.
Okay, I think now is the time to close this session. Let's express thanks again to our present and discussants.